Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Hi, everyone. Glad to see you all here. Decoding bias and hate on social media is part of the Common Ground initiative, where we're creating programmatic forums that encourage constructive dialogue and tackle challenging issues. Dr. Matthias Becker's work perfectly fits into Common Ground's goal in understanding media role in shaping what we know. We know that our social media feeds are manipulated by algorithms. All the more reason to know how to decode biases and hate online so we can recognize and combat the spread of those biases online and off. This is where Dr. Becker comes in. Aside from being a linguist and digital communication expert, he's thoughtful, serious, a dedicated expert in his field, and he wants to make the world a better place. Dr. Matthias Becker has spent over a decade studying online hate. He just finished a $3 million plus research grant on decoding hate in all its forms and wrote a book about it, a must-read for any book club that has the time for 450 pages. He regularly advises governments and tech companies on ways to mitigate online hatred. He also serves as editor-in-chief of the Digital Hate Review. In his new position at NYU as the Address Hate Research Scholar, he's exploring digital hate, implicit communication, and the social impact of AI-driven platforms. We are especially fortunate to have him here today so we can link his work with the Decode Hate video challenge. We have some of the most serious and dedicated students who we just spent an hour with from across South Connecticut taking part in this challenge, so they too can start to recognize hate, they probably already know it, and biases online and offline, and connect the dots. I just want to take a moment to thank a few people. First, the Westport Library and its remarkable team, including the Common Ground Initiative Committee, and in particular, Olivier and Jake, who are here tonight. I want to also thank the Gerber Family Foundation for sponsoring the video competition, the Lucketts for once again bringing some Colby Cathedral Prep School students here, and Fairfield Jewish Advocacy Coalition, Lauren and Lori, who worked to bring Fairfield Prep students here. And special thanks to Eliza Roth and her fellow mentors, Ari and Ella, who are here from NYU to help the teens actually act as their mentor during this next process that we have with the video challenge. Finally, thank you to everyone here today, especially the students. And now it's time to welcome Dr. Becker. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. So, yeah, I also wanted to thank the Westport Library and the Common Ground Initiative for the invitation and the interest in my work, and particularly Lisa Weitzman and Howard Edelstein, good friends of mine here in Westport, who planned this event with me back in 2025, and of course, very grateful for your presence on that evening. One quick note before we start, I think this is really important when we talk about bias and hate. Obviously, given the topic, there will be in the next 50 minutes a lot of material that is hostile and dehumanizing, hate speech and the wider patterns of communication. Nothing graphic or violent. What's hard about it is the inherent demonization and exclusion and the way it circulates in ordinary looking digital contexts. And let me just start with something concrete, something specific. Let me see. So this is a screenshot. This is a screenshot from a YouTube channel, a mainstream social media platform used by millions every day. And the host is George Galloway, a British politician, and his guest is Dan Bilzerian, an American influencer with more than 30 million followers on Instagram, now running for the US House of Representatives and making a lot of headlines in the last weeks. Bilzerian has a long documented record of anti-Semitic posts. I won't go into details right now, but I think something that is really important these days, he's running against a sitting Republican congressman named Randy Fine, who happens to be Jewish. And Galloway introduces his guest by then referring to Fine as, and I'm quoting here directly, these are not my words, the Hebrew hammer, one of the most loathsome reptiles ever to slither across the floor of the Capitol. And I want you to hold two things in mind. First, in this context, reptile is not a casual insult. The verb slither activates the idea, the understanding of a snake, one of the oldest anti-Semitic images that we know from in Western tradition. You can trace it back to the 19th century. It got all the time updated in current political contexts and conspiracy theories. And it's something that we as linguists, that we would call a dehumanizing frame. The target becomes a different kind of creature, cunning, venomous, disloyal, and his destruction becomes more acceptable. Second, look at the title of the video. I hope you can read it. I think he should be hanged for treason. So they refer to Randy Fine. The word hanged has an asterisk through it. That asterisk is doing work. The phrase reads immediately the same to a human reader, but to YouTube's moderation system, it's not the same word. Nothing in the title, not the implied call for violence, the call for hanging, not the target, not the anti-Semitic framing, is in the description would necessarily be caught by automatic content moderation. And these are, of course, not fringe personalities, right? These are famous people. I would even call them authorities for a certain amount of followers. It's not a fringe show. The interview was watched hundreds of thousands of times. And now look at the comment section. So right at the beginning, you find statements like that one. They call you an anti-Semite, but never a liar. Dan Bilzerian, 217 likes. What's being said here indirectly is that the hate directed against Jews might be labeled as anti-Semitism, but it doesn't disqualify the claim itself. And the user profile, you can see Donald Trump in this appearance of the so-called happy merchant, an anti-Semitic meme that also has a long tradition coming from white supremacy contexts. And it alludes to the idea that the President of the United States is controlled by Jewish actors or even Jewish himself. And this is something that you can find also when you think of Bill Gates, when you think of Jordan Peterson, when he interviewed Netanyahu. These claims always come up. And other examples would be, remember Dan is not suicidal, 591 likes. And what is alluded to here in this statement is obviously that there's a high probability that as soon as someone speaks out against Jews, against Israel, or whatever, there's a high probability that this person is going to be killed. But this is not said explicitly, it's alluded to. And very often these moderation systems cannot identify that because they don't have the context knowledge, they don't have the world knowledge. But you see in the comment section that people immediately understand that. For instance, somebody asked, they better not touch Dan. And the question here would be, who's they? And another comment says, or refers directly to the Mossad. So the bridge is immediately activated. It cannot always be activated by the systems themselves, but as sensitive human readers, we immediately understand the allusion. So nothing in that comment section would be caught by most content moderation systems. Mossad isn't a slur. the conspiracy narrative is not expressed explicitly, and that makes it so difficult. So what's happening here is the comment section is kind of completing the work of the video. So the video starts with a dehumanizing trope using medieval anti-Semitic imagery, and the comment section produced the next logical step, referring to Jewish power and activating conspiracy narratives. And conspiracy narratives are a very interesting phenomenon. It's not just for a form of demonization that you can find in various contexts when we talk about, for instance, misogyny, sexism, or racism, which always leads to that point that a specific group is portrayed as being inferior. But with a conspiracy narrative, you actually say that the group you are talking about is actually superior. So as a second step, you victimize yourself, because there's someone behind the curtain, someone up there that is able to control you. And when you think of the shooting in Pittsburgh in 2017, the perpetrator who went into that synagogue and killed dozens of people was kind of completely sold on this conspiracy narrative of a great replacement theory. So the idea that there's a Jewish lobby that orchestrates mass immigration in order to destroy the white Western Christian society. So I'm saying that because conspiracy narratives have an incredible impact on different societies. It's not just demonization, it leads very often to physical action, to physical violence, due to this effect of emotions like fear. It's not always hate. This is also something that we should be aware of. Hate speech doesn't mean hateful speech. Hate speech is it's an umbrella term that refers to all sorts of emotions that can be activated by these stories. So I'm presenting this slide here in order to show how, for instance, a specific hate ideology, it doesn't have to be anti-Semitism, can be expressed without slurs, without emotional words. And I was just talking to someone here about the amount of research projects and also civil society organizations that look into online hate speech and conspiracy narratives and disinformation. And very often, the approach that you can find is looking for slurs, trying to understand what kind of groups are demonized in a specific way, through slurs or through emotional words using sentiment analysis. Let me just correct that a little bit. But of course, this is only part of the problem. When you actually do some more analysis of online content, you can see that slurs are maybe 10% of those comments that actually express demonizing ideas. So Lisa already said something about my background. I'm a cognitive linguist by training. I was always interested in the way in which societies use kind of power relations, talking about different groups, what you can actually say about the thinking and collective emotions based on the words people use in history, but also in contemporary discourse. So very often, language and communication in general are some kind of an open door into the mindset of people, right? It's not just a way to describe reality. When you actually understand how today here in the US or in the UK or in Germany, people talk about specific groups, you can reconstruct what's going on in that society. It's very often an aspect that has been overlooked. And especially for social media studies, if we want to understand how implicit bias comes along, how hate speech is being generated, this whole thing about like understanding what words actually do to you, how they affect you, is extremely crucial. And this is something that very often hasn't been really followed or has been ignored to a large extent. And I think this is a huge problem for the future of democracy, that we are not really looking into this. So again, my background is cognitive linguistics. I've been working on various projects on decoding hate speech, decoding anti-Semitism, decoding hate in general. And since last November, I've been working at NYU, looking into the different patterns of online bigotry that you can find and use our linguistic analysis in order to train LLMs to identify that as a second step. During my talk, I will get to different issues that we need to be aware of. it's very important if we want to understand the mechanics that lead to societal bias and hate speech. We need to understand the overall structure of the discourse. And of course, a very central part in this whole thing and this whole approach is we need to ask questions like the relationship between free speech and hate speech, and show why that question, as it's usually asked, was built for a communication environment that no longer exists. Second would be platforms, what platforms actually changed and why the machinery of online discourse, its mechanisms and dynamics are different from what most people realize. A third part would be a very common discussion, malicious actors. How do bad actors, foreign actors, actually orchestrate discourse in our own country? This picture is very often incomplete, even though it's true, but it's definitely just one part of the problem. And the fourth part would be communication in general. So the communication layer that sits underneath all of it, the iceberg below the waterline, that is what circulates and remains unseen but changes the perception of millions of people. And at the end, I want to close with what I think this means for all of us, not as a policy argument, but as a civic one. Let me start with that first question, where's the line and who gets to draw it? This question is one that almost every public conversation about online content eventually reaches, and it's a question with a deep civic history. There are different societies that have answered that question in different ways. Let me pick like two scenarios, the United States and Europe. The American tradition, which most of you have lived in your whole lives, starts from the First Amendment, right? Speech is broadly protected, the exceptions are narrow and specific, incitement to imminent lawless action, threats, defamation, and so on. The civic logic underneath is the marketplace of ideas. Bad speech should be answered with better speech. The state is not to be trusted with drawing the line, because the line will move with whoever holds power. That's a coherent tradition, and it has served this country for a long time. But it's not the only way democracies have answered this question. In Germany, where I grew up in and worked for many years, the law takes a different approach. Here, there's a legal concept called incitement of the people, which criminalizes speech that incites hatred against identifiable groups. So the post-Holocaust civic logic is simple. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It can be dismantled from within through speech that erodes the moral standing of entire groups of people. And Germany is not alone in this regard. So you also have France, you have the UK, you have Austria, all of continental and much of common law Europe operate on similar premises. So the idea is always not only because of foreign adversaries, but because of the conditions under which we communicate with each other, we need to take language seriously. Speech can pull up the worst in us, and the surface of civilization, which, if you look at thousands of years of human history, really is thin, it can give way faster than people expect. That's the historical experience of Europe, the European tradition. It takes seriously the idea that language is never just a system that describes reality, but language shapes reality. So looking at the US and Europe, neither tradition is the right answer. They reflect different historical experiences, and both are legitimate. But here's the thing, both frameworks, the American and the European one, were built around the same underlying model of communication. The model goes like this. You have a speaker, you have an intent, you can actually identify the intent by connecting the message with the individual. And of course, you have society that hears the message, and society decides whether the act crosses a line or not. And that model worked for centuries because it described how speech actually circulated at that time. But it doesn't describe well what we are dealing with today. Let me give you the single most important finding from the last years of research on that. So in one of our projects called Decoding Antisemitism, we analyzed over 300,000 user comments qualitatively and then use that also in order to train large language models. And what we found repeatedly across languages and platforms is that a substantial portion of anti-Semitic content is produced by people who would sincerely say they are not anti-Semitic. And that's a really important part, because this is also something that we need to understand about language. Language communicates through us. There's something that we call discourse. There's a certain understanding of normality in a specific point in time. When you sometimes watch movies from the 1970s or 1960s, you will see that the habits of how people communicate with each other were different at that time. Things change over time, and the differences are, of course, much bigger the more you go back into the history. And for the user comments that we analyzed, we could see a lot of them were not extremists. They are not members of any organized hate community. They are ordinary people who have absorbed tropes, framings, and coded references from their discourse environment, from their childhood, from their upbringing, also the videos they watched. So the anti-Semitic content is embedded in the way they think about certain topics. They deploy it without recognizing that it's anti-Semitism. But this is something that we have in common with the past, right? This was all the time the case when anti-Semitism or any other hate ideology was moved from one generation to another. But the point today is that today it's happening on a completely different scale. What we can see these days is that, of course, a user can get in touch with anti-Semitic ideas in their feed much more often than, for instance, a person in the 19th century was confronted with anti-Semitic tropes throughout their lifetime. And that changes the whole game. So it's a much faster process, and it's also the problem of that this kind of intentional speaker model that we know from legal contexts doesn't work anymore, because of course, we have to acknowledge that very often the intent online is not really clear. So you can find a conspiracy narrative or a racist statement against people of color, and you don't know if the person is really aware of what they actually say in this context. Because it's not always a slur, which would be intentional, but it can just be a construct. It can be a stereotype that people just are used to say. So the question, did this person mean to say something hateful, is often unanswerable, because users are black box, very often a black box, and you cannot identify what the trigger is. And then, of course, we have the issue of that the speakers very often don't know what they are saying, or that the discourse is actually the agent, because again, people are communicating through their understanding of what is normal and what is not normal. And here the question would be, how can we identify responsibility? Who's actually responsible for a statement? Of course, the web user who says something, but it's also the platform that is triggering certain ideas through algorithms, also people who reshare certain ideas. So this is actually part of the whole ecosystem. Apart from that, I just mentioned social media companies and platforms. You can't understand what's happening to public discourse without first understanding the machine that shapes it. So social media platforms are not neutral, a neutral communication infrastructure in the way that roads or telephone networks are. They are attention markets. Their business model is simple. The longer you stay on the platform, the more ads you see, the more revenue the companies generate. Everything else, the content, the connections, the conversations, is in service of that single metric, time on platform. Now the question is, what keeps people on a platform longest? The answer, which these companies have known for many years from their own internal research, is emotional activation. So not information, not connection, it's the emotion, and specifically the negative end of the emotional spectrum: outrage, fear, moral indignation. And these states are more activating than positive emotions. So we are talking about an engagement loop. Content enters the system, it produces an emotional reaction, the reaction drives engagement, likes, and so on, and the engagement signals the algorithm that this context is valuable. And then you have this kind of circular movement, which is of course common throughout all platforms. And I guess many of you have seen that movie, that documentary that came out 6 years ago already, The Social Dilemma, that brought this into public conversation. It showed something important. The people who built these systems understood key aspects of what these systems would do and built them anyway. So there was absolute clarity about the aspect that people are getting more and more engaged, more and more depending on these platforms, and very often these emotions that have been triggered through these platforms were negative ones. And just recently, last November, this study came out. A team of researchers from Stanford, the University of Washington, and Northeastern published a landmark study in Science, and they built a browser extension that kind of re-ranked users' X feeds during the 2024 presidential election. And then they did surveys afterwards in order to see what people actually thought about the respective opposing party. And they could compare these two target groups and even, asking the same target group over time, like 3 days with the standard ranking through X's algorithms, and then 7 days where actually this plugin was changing the order and pushed down those statements, those posts and comments that actually contained negative emotions. And the effect was significant. So just through the way in which information is being structured through social media companies leads to effects like polarization in our society. So it's never just detached. It's never just people who want to be engaged in aggressive statements or, demonize the other side of a political spectrum. It is very often just the frequency with which they see emotionalizing content. So I definitely recommend that study, and if you're interested, please scan the QR code. It's a very, I think there's a lot of research been done on that, but of course there's still not 100% clarity of how these algorithms actually work in all detail. But the finding I keep coming back to, the one I think captures something essential about our situation is this, that 74% of participants reported noticing no impact of their experience whatsoever. So there was a shift in perception, but it was not taken into account. It was not conscious among web users because the algorithms work so in such a sensitive, in such a elaborate way. So that's not a glitch, that's the design. It's built into what shows up when you open your phone in the morning. So to summarize this, we are living in an attention economy that systematically rewards emotional activation that operates below the threshold of our conscious awareness. And that is changing how we feel about the people around us in ways we don't detect. And of course, this has massive effects on democracy, it has effects on social cohesion, and we are actually confronted with a large market square of ideas that we don't really understand, even though language and communication always had massive effects on society. So that's the system. Now what happens when people who want to spread harmful content figure out how the system works? And that would be, of course, the big topic, malicious actors, right? So when we try to explain harm online, we usually reach for the same answer. Bad actors, foreign governments, running influence operations, sometimes extremist groups radicalizing young people, malicious individuals, and so on. And that's all true. But it's not the end of the story, right? What I just said about algorithmic amplification is a huge factor. Bad actors play a huge role. But if we just say that the only problem we are facing are Russian bot farms or Chinese disinformation, we wouldn't really understand how human psyche works, and that aggression and confrontation and kind of the friction that we know from human history was always part of us, and it gets back to us through the anonymity that we have online. So, but it's definitely an incredibly important part of the equation. Once you understand the engagement logic, the arrival of bad actors makes structural sense. And just, I think you remember that a few months ago, X, the platform X, published this location feature, which was you could see a bipartisan response that was very enthusiastic. And the idea was more or less, now we understand how hatred in our own society, disinformation actually unfolds and who's responsible for that. But again, this is just one part of the problem. I would say that that extremists very often just study the way in which the system of amplification actually works, and they were kind of reverse engineering that system. So extremists did exactly this with platforms. The platforms were built for advertising revenue to maximize time on platforms through emotional activation, and extremists figured that out empirically what it rewards. And they discovered often before researchers did what the engagement logic rewards, and they build their communication strategies accordingly. So the result is, of course, that you have these radicalization pipelines, that you have, for instance, fringe communities, fringe platforms. They spread ideas about specific groups, and that is getting more and more mainstream because they orchestrate that in a certain way so that it can penetrate politically moderate contexts. And each step looks more moderate than the last. An extreme idea gets softened, memed, ironized, reframed as a question rather than a claim. Again, we are getting back to implicitness, to coded hate speech, because it's always the coded forms that seem acceptable, even though they communicate the exact same idea, but just the pattern, the way in which these things are expressed, make them seemingly acceptable in politically moderate contexts. And this chain of amplification depends on ordinary users, right? So we are not just innocent in this whole context. Not extremists, it's ordinary people who share something because it made them laugh or made them angry or seemed to confirm something they already believed. The content travels on the back of normal social behavior, which means the problem is not just a handful of bad actors at the source, it's a system in which all of us can become, without knowing it, infrastructure for the spread of harmful content. So because of the real mechanism is not always who is sending the content, it's very often how and the content is structured to survive, right? It's the way algorithms work, it's the way in which bad actors package their information and then share it with other groups. That's a layer almost nobody talks about, and that's where we are going next, the message itself, right? Because communication is not just based on specific words, it's whole phrases, it's the argumentation that comes along, and content moderation or the AI system platforms identify and remove harmful content, but it's very often built around a relatively simple model. Hate speech looks like hate speech, slurs, explicit calls to violence, overt dehumanization. But if you can match content against a list of prohibited categories, you flag it, you remove it, and you are done. But the problem is, when you go, for instance, through a comment section on a specific topic that might sound explosive, and you find, for instance, 20–25% of the content that is hateful, that expresses stereotypes, prejudices in some way, you will see that these examples very often don't contain any slur. They contain allusions, they contain puns, and so on. And that means that you are very often just looking at the tip of the iceberg with the methods we use. Above the waterline, the content that gets caught. Below the waterline, everything that circulates freely because it has been constructed to evade detection while doing the same work. So we tend to reach for one of two explanations: bad actors, foreign governments, extremist bots, the one I pushed back on earlier, or algorithms. For instance, the thing that was also made more publicly available through the Social Dilemma documentary. Both are real, neither is wrong, but when they are offered as the whole story, something important gets dropped. And what gets dropped is the layer that involves the rest of us. So there's a third factor, I would even call that communication conditions online, the anonymity, the velocity of information, the high probability that you get confronted with hate speech and that these things normalize over time. So take these four together, the ones that I just mentioned, also the mutual confirmation between web users, and you have an environment in which the ordinary friction that holds civilized discourse in place has been substantially weakened. And just getting back to this kind of three-level structure, algorithmic amplification, malicious actors, and these communication conditions that you find online that are so not the same than the ones in offline contexts, you can see that even if you just imagine a group of people just put into a room for a certain amount of time without any algorithms, without any orchestration from outside, and you just turn off the lights, and all these cultural norms that were created over decades and centuries would just fall apart, you would see that these individuals would radicalize in a very short period of time. And that's more or less what you can see online. So I would argue even without algorithms and the overall structure, you would find, given the anonymity, the lack of accountability among web users, you would find a slow but steady radicalization throughout the time. So the honest picture is three-layered. Bad actors exploit the system, algorithms amplify the loudest content, and these conditions I was just mentioning shape what ordinary people produce when they participate. So this could be like a complete diagnosis of the problem. What I want to add to that picture is also how coded speech looks like. It's not just the words, it's not just, whether there's some kind of a standard slogan that you can find. People are extremely creative. That's why surveys very often don't work when it comes to hate speech, because there's something that we call social desirability. So people who think they have a problem with a specific group, but they wouldn't be able to say it because it's not really acceptable to say it, they wouldn't answer that. They wouldn't say that in a survey, again, because of the effect of social desirability, the priming effects that you have, the artificial situation that we see when we participate in a survey. You can do all sorts of surveys if you're interested in the way people consume or what they vote for in the next elections. When it comes to hate speech, when it comes to hate ideologies, this is something that a lot of people, I wouldn't generalize, but a lot of people are not proud of, or they would say, if I say that, I might lose my job, and therefore I don't answer straightforwardly. But in that moment when they enter the online sphere, when they get into digital communication, and they are more or less invisible. Of course, that has changed, or there are also border boundaries for that. But just the fact that they are not in an offline situation, sitting at the same table with someone else, they can just say whatever they want, to some extent. That will have a long-term effect also on the side of the bystanders. So if somebody just reads something about, I don't know, the European Union or Britain or whatever, whatever topic you are interested in, and you just see in the comment section an abundance of hateful, derogatory statements, people will get used to that over time, because we are all kind of really the product of the circumstances around us. That has always been the case in history. So therefore, it would be completely naive to think that these two spaces of communication are detached. And if we acknowledge, and I think we have to acknowledge, that the digital communication, that social media platforms are the place for political debate today, we need to listen to these signals, and we need to understand them in real time. So, again, a big difference to surveys. These are self-motivated statements. These are not artificial statements that somebody is asking you to answer or to comment on. But you see a news article and you just say what you really feel and think. And you think that nobody is actually against or can hinder you of doing so. And we just need to find a way to read these statements in a good way, in a reliable way, and at scale. Because everything that we find online, everything that becomes predominant online, will shape the reality of tomorrow. It will shape the way in which society, collectives think and feel. This has always been the case. And it has been, it's kind of crazy that it has been so not controlled over such a long period of time. I'm not talking about censorship, but I'm talking definitely about awareness and knowing that this is the prominent place, the dominant place for political debate, and not only that one, and we are just still looking at some kind of a black box, and we don't have tools to measure it reliably. I'm happy to sit with any data scientist on this planet in one room and just check the way in which these models function. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of stuff, you know, when you think of the tip of the iceberg, is not taken into account. So we don't know it. And if you go through academic journals and you see, wow, there's this project on online hatred, or there's this civil society organization, just don't get carried away by the seemingly like huge amount of these research projects. They are all pretty narrow in their effect, in the way, in the amount of what they can process. Look at the methodologies. Be always certain that all studies that we have at the moment are exploratory. We don't have a consistent, coherent approach to what's going on online. Nobody can tell you how often racism occurs on X, how anti-Semitism, how often it occurs on Instagram. We just don't have the tools yet. And these are really bad news if we acknowledge that this is the place where things are happening in the future, in the present and in the future. So as you all know, my focus in the last 10 years was anti-Semitism, so I don't know how much time I have. Do I have a little bit more time? I would just give you a couple of examples what I actually mean by implicitness, by coded speech, again, below the surface of the waterline. Just in a very short, in a nutshell, and again, this is not only true for Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, this is true for misogyny, for sexism, racism, and so on, homophobia. Just talking about the stereotypes themselves is interesting, but you always need to think, also when we talk about advertising, when we talk about political speech, it's not always the content, it's also the structure, it's the pattern. And that's the language, that's the communication. And as soon as you see the concept about people of color being inferior or Jews being superior, you have different ways in which these ideas are being shared, right? And the more you see a discrepancy between the statement and the idea behind it, the more you delve into the realm of implicitness. And that's really important to understand because everybody needs to know that in particularly in mainstream discourse, and this is also very important for younger generations, hateful ideas can be repackaged in so many sophisticated ways. And we need to understand how this level of sophistication can be deconstructed. And these are just a few examples. Again, I don't want to go too much into anti-Semitism, but here you just see an attempt. This is a tiny, tiny part of the classification system that we developed, where you can see these are all different forms of implicitness, starting from the word level, getting further down from puns to allusions, to indirect speech acts like irony, rhetorical questions, and so on. And just to give you a few examples on that. But for instance, when you look at that statement, I think you all remember Spielberg's movie, so people can refer to that and just change the surface of the word to some extent, and they immediately can activate an anti-Semitic idea behind it. So it's not Schindler, it's actually Schwindler, the swindle. So here you have the idea of the Holocaust actually being a hoax, right? Or List in German would mean also cunning. So there's a whole idea of storytelling behind it, and it brings in one slogan two anti-Semitic tropes together. It's the idea that the Holocaust didn't happen, and B, that it is actually being exploited. Or another example, when you go from puns, where the surface of the word is being changed, to allusions, and you look at that example, someone should give George Soros a shower. There you have, of course, the historical allusion to the gas chambers, but you need to have historical knowledge in order to understand that this is a coded death wish. And again, many other things. You probably remember the shooting last year in May in DC. So there was a user comment that said 2 killed or 6 million, right? So 6 million obviously referring to the Holocaust, and like implicitly communicating, oh, again, Jewish victims, what do they want, you know, and also implicitly trivializing the crimes of during of the Holocaust. So these are just a few examples, and of course this is just for language. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that there's of course there are hateful images as well, verbal, visual, audiovisual, multimodal. This is all really important in order to understand hate speech. This is, I guess you all know, I mentioned before that the happy merchant meme, a white supremacy tradition or convention that refers to Jews as being sly, of being lying and hypocritical and controlling different forms of the industry, or being behind 9/11. So this is a rather conventional form of multimodal anti-Semitism that you can easily find online. Of course, these things also get updated when you think of Ukraine, US president, the vaccine, or the pandemic. And of course, today you have something that's called deep fakes, where you actually have AI-generated content that gets back to these ideas in kind of in an innovative form, right? So you have, for instance, the happy merchant responsible for mass immigration. You have, I hope you can see that here in the middle. Again, the pattern of the happy merchant reoccurs, but this time it's the idea that Jews are responsible for the destruction of the white race, right? The eternal sin, the snake and the apple. So I hope you can see it. It's all kind of reoccurring, imitating the shape of the happy merchant. So again, there are no boundaries for expressing these ideas. And this is just one of the last examples. It looks pretty innocent at the beginning, but when you close your eyes a little bit, you can see what is actually written in these palm trees. Can you read it? Yes, okay. Yeah, everyone? So again, there are no boundaries, and that holds true for linguistic, verbal patterns that I've been studying for more than 10 years, and of course that also holds true for visual patterns, that also holds true for audiovisual content. People communicate. If you remember the reference to the surveys, people allude to hateful ideas in creative ways, which is also called communication latency, or detour communication. And it's not only about content moderation and, being sanctioned or something like that. This is not the only point, because otherwise, why would you find that stuff on white supremacy platforms where you basically don't have any content moderation? The idea here is to say something about a group that person seems to despise in a way that not everybody understands. So by alluding to an idea that the majority society doesn't really get, you build some kind of a communicative proximity between yourself and your peer group that understands what you're saying, right? Think about red pills, blue pills, the matrix. Think about the understanding that society consists only of sheep, so-called sheeple, and just a specific group of people actually understands who's responsible for this or that. And that makes it so attractive. That's why you can find these indirect forms of bigotry also in mainstream, but also in fringe communities. And again, with this project, we tried to study that in more detail. 30 scholars, history, linguistics, and so on, different universities involved in the last 5 years. Now this project will be continued at NYU with a wider focus. It's not just anti-Semitism, it's also anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and misogyny, and we will expand this further. And Lisa mentioned one of our publications. So if you want to read a little bit more about the different layers between explicit and implicit anti-Semitism, this book might be helpful. It's open access, so just scan the code. You have a variety of chapters that refer to anti-Semitism. Of course, this always depends on your definition of anti-Semitism, right? There are different definitions on anti-Semitism. We worked with the IRA definition, but the most important part here is not the question, is this already anti-Semitic or not? But just look at specific chapters and try to understand why this particular idea is communicated without having any indicators on the word level. What do you need to know as not only as a scholar, but also as a person that takes language seriously and propaganda? What do you need to know in order to deconstruct something? And language is everywhere. Language is in politics, language is in our society, it's in advertising, it's in the media. So knowing a little bit more of like how implicitness works will definitely help our society also to stay critical, to survive, to be engaged, to have different topics, and have a real conversation without attacking each other. So these are just a few elements. Just here, okay, I'm trying to end. This is really the last slide. What do we do with this? And I think the impact or the implications of that kind of work is something that is on everyone's mind. Just describing hate online or bias or conspiracy narratives, whatever you're interested in, won't solve the issue. But what we can do is to take social media studies and to plug it into different formats, for instance, education, right? So actually looking at current patterns of bias and hate and communicate that in classrooms and creating something like social media literacy is absolutely key, is absolutely important, because otherwise people are just growing up with social media without actually knowing what's happening to them when they consume all that content. And of course, there are many other target groups that could learn from that. First and foremost, I guess, also AI companies who also build guardrails or try to improve their guardrails in order to have AI systems that are able to detect all these forms of hatred and conspiracy narratives. And I think on the individual level, what I can just say is when you are engaging in online discourse, in online debates, and you know that there's something like algorithmic amplification, there is a highly emotionalizing discourse that you are confronted with. Before you respond to a statement, just wait a couple of seconds and see whether it's actually worth it. Because of the velocity that we have online and the way in which people just engage in things that seem to collide with their self-image or their understanding of what is right and what is wrong, we are actually seeing all these escalation dynamics online because we all participate, at least the active parts, in online discourse. So just be aware that a quick response, emotional response, is never really helpful to build bridges between the different segments of society, and think about how a constructive future, maybe also one day with social media companies that don't reward negative emotions, but that move into a different direction and look at the positive impact on society, how this future could look like. And this, I guess, brings us all a little bit back to the very early hours of the internet, where people were still dreaming of a place where actually there's a lot of interconnectivity, people can learn from each other. You know, the future will be democracy because people understand each other better. But due to all these factors that I just described, this is unfortunately not the case. Okay, until here, thank you so much for your interest. And I'm very happy to hear your questions.
If anyone has any questions, if you could come over here to the microphone so that we can hear the question.